Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Josie and the Pussycats from 2001. Back in the 1990s, there was kind of this huge cultural shift between the kind of beginning of the decade and the latter part of the decade. The beginning being more like kind of alternative music and like REM and Nirvana and, the whole grunge thing and all that stuff. And then by the end of the decade, you had the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, and it felt almost like the music industry, because of the way media was consumed then, and you didn't really have the choice in like Spotify and you could pick what you wanted to listen to. You're basically like force-fed things through MTV and radio, and what they felt like pushing kind of what got the most promotion. And it did sort of feel like there was like this vast conspiracy or something like that, even though there really wasn't. And people did actually enjoy this music. They weren't as kind of hypnotized like this movie is suggesting, but it did definitely feel like that. And I think Josie and the Pussycats came because of that. Now I know the writer-directors Harry Elephant and Deborah Kaplan have pretty much said this, and they sort of have a lot more fun with that feeling, and even the parodies of boy bands that were actually pretty prevalent through the late 1990s and early 2000s, which would never be that funny other than, what was it, Together? I don't even know if anyone remembers that, but most people didn't really do anything that interesting or fun with those things. That's why most of them didn't live on, and they had a little more fun with that, while also saying something about capitalism when it was at its supreme height right before 9/11, as this came out in April of 2001, and was even smart enough to be a couple months early to kind of pop punk really exploding in the summer of 2001 and 2002. I think one of the things that's always really worked about this film is it's not so much concerned with being an adaptation of Josie and the Pussycats as it has more concern with really being a statement on capitalism and consumerism at the time in the early 2000s, which is also what really works about it. It's kind of funny in a way, because this might be one of the best comic book and cartoon adaptations that really seems to care about the source material, but not enough, because I don't remember any episodes of the cartoon like this. I've never read the comic, but I couldn't find anything. It seems like this was wholly and originally created by the writer-directors, and even though most of the time when you hear that, you're like, oh, this is going to be awful, this is amazing, and it has so much fun with that. Now, Josie and the Pussycats is basically about the band Josie and the Pussycats, who are just kind of a local girl punk rock band, and after a band du jour has found out that an evil Mega Records is putting subliminal messages lower in the mix of their music, they are killed in, or presumably killed in, a plane crash, and Mega Records decides to sign Josie and the Pussycats and make them the new big thing, and make them into mega superstars using their subliminal messaging. And Josie and the Pussycats become huge in a week, take over the world as they kind of uncover what's been going on with subliminal messaging using Mr. Movie Phone. Now this really does use a lot of 2000s era pop culture and brands to push, at a time when if you went to Times Square at the time, it was covered in logos and companies, and that was very fashionable. And we did kind of have this huge change in the 90s and the early 2000s from this kind of artistically weird art school kids to being super corporate, are you wearing these kind of jeans kind of era. And I like that it was saying more than just oh, the kids are wrong or something, instead of saying oh, well, corporate America is wrong. It's I really do appreciate that, actually. And I think that's something that made this film kind of grow in terms of esteem for people, because I knew anyone who would eventually see it, which was mostly on home video, I don't know anyone who saw it in theaters, freaked out about this movie because of everything it was saying. Now, there was a common misconception in both reviews, and I remember from people at the time, that this film basically did what the 1989 Batman movie directed by Tim Burton did, which was basically it paid off its budget before it was released because of marketing deals and stuff. Josie and the Pussycats did not do that with all the brand sponsorships and stuff. It wasn't a shrewd let's make a statement on capitalism while also paying this all off with product placements. They actually asked all the brands to be in here to make a statement with it. I don't know if all of them would have participated if they were actually paying them. That would probably be a different situation, but according to the directors, they were not paid, although maybe that's a deeper conspiracy. Oh shit. But anyway, they actually asked to do that, and it's interesting so many of them were game to that, but since I guess they probably assumed this wouldn't be that big, there's very few shots in this film that don't have a brand or a corporation within it, and that's really how these things work. Consumerism was so big at the time. I remember there was a summer they were pushing you should get 3 copies of a CD, one for home, one for your Discman, one for your car, and I was like, what? And it was right when CD burners were really big. I've never found out like the origin of that, but I remember for a little bit they were like kept pushing, like the VJs would push that. I was like, I've always wondered, like, I don't know a recording of it, but I was like, who can afford, that's like 30 fucking bucks, man. Like, what the fuck? Like, this is like a lot of money. 16. I'm like really happy I had this $20 to buy this album. Like, leave me alone. I like that it pointed that out because it was rising so much at the time, and the main criticism or satire was more on, you know, how like Carson Daly looked gay or something. And it's like wasn't really that interesting, and this actually had something to say with it. Also, I think is one of the few times you had a female fronted rock band at the time. Like the Donnas would take a few years to really break. They were known, but they weren't really that big. As well as I think the kind of Simpsons like humor throughout this, even like the thing like, wait, why did that take a week to happen? It feels like very much like, I mean, I think the Simpsons did the same sort of thing with that boy band episode. But so did the Simpsons do it first? I wonder. The whole idea of like kind of satirizing what was going on at the time, and even reusing an Archie Comics property in a whole new way. This was actually a major precursor to even like what Riverdale will do. It shows like Archie Comics is pretty cool about their adaptation. And I think like the comedic timing between the three girls, Tara Reid, who's doing a really good kind of dumb blonde performance, like much like Amanda Seyfried in Mean Girls. It kind of makes me, I've heard people recently reassessing Tara Reid because she was kind of like ripped apart because of various scandals on the E! Show and all that stuff, but she's really good in here, as well as Rosario Dawson, which I think was this her like first big Hollywood thing post Kids or something, and Rachel Lee Cook, who basically had her whole career ruined after this bombed, which is unfortunate because I heard so much love for this movie afterwards. But I think also like if you look at the other teen movies at the time, they're very much going towards what you're supposed to do in culture, and this was far more aggressively like doing it while also giving you a middle finger. Like, you know, it's like one thing, it's like it definitely is being a teen movie at the time, but it's also completely rejecting that notion at the opposite time of that, which is an interesting line to take. You know, even though like the soundtrack went gold, like they definitely like sold merchandise and stuff like that, at the same time bring up a lot of issues that makes you like question the whole idea of it. The soundtrack, which was produced by Babyface, who makes an appearance in this, in the guy who was in Captain and Tennille thing, which I thought was fun. I was like, who is that? That's somebody, I know it. Apparently his kids didn't recognize him either when they rewatched it, so I appreciate that. Also as Adam Schlesinger, who would write from Crazy Ex-Girlfriend and did That Thing You Do. The songs were sung by a singer from Letters from Cleo. Like they had like a really good amount of songwriters and producers working on this who wanted to try different things. Like Babyface was like, I never get to do like rock stuff, so why not? And a lot of people actually wanted to work on this. Like the role Rosario Dawson got, they had between like Aaliyah, Beyonce, and Lisa Left Eye Lopez actually all auditioned for. I don't know how Lisa Left Eye Lopez would have worked, but apparently she auditioned a bunch of times. That seems very bizarre. I don't think would have worked, but whatever. I think why this film has gotten to live on is because it is so unique. You know, you do have like Ladies and Gentlemen, The Fabulous Stains, which is a great girl rock band movie, but I think what this does is, one, it is doing something unique. It's setting up a property, but it's also like very much doing something with the whole idea of doing this. I mean, from the two people who also worked on the Brady Bunch movies, which also like question that whole thing. I think this might have been the end of the like ironic kind of remake thing, which I quite like that whole idea, to be honest with you. I think it's actually kind of quite fascinating. I don't think we get another one till the Dora movie, really, where they're like as much playing with the idea of it as doing it, and this totally does that 100%. Even mentions like, why are you here? Is like, oh, because I'm in the comic book. Like it totally sets up the whole idea of it while doing it. And I think a lot of what was going on is people accepting capitalism and consumerism at the time, and this is one of the few times that you see at the time where people are questioning it. That's not like, you know, System of a Down or something. It's very obviously doing it and very like pushing it forward. This is doing it with like, you know, glitter and the time period, which I think is like, why? Because it wasn't presented the way we felt that was socially acceptable. It was probably rejected in such a way. Like even reviews like in the later 2000s sort of reassessing it aren't entirely nice, or like shitting on Tara Reid or shitting on this person or something. And I think, you know, having like this great performance of Parker Posey, who I think is a bit much, but that's like sort of the point. Like her and Alan Cumming clearly are having fun playing to the hill. Like they get this is big and broad. The thing is, it's like it's clearly a remake of a very well established cartoon. Like they even like, it wasn't in Kicking and Streaming, they have a whole section where they talk about when Josie and the Pussycats went to outer space. Like it was very much a Gen X thing. When they do it in the Flintstones, it's acceptable. Because this was a little weirder about this adaptation, it wasn't, which it's almost interesting to look at how this film handled things rather than if they just did a straight ahead like Josie and the Pussycat thing, which they could have like waited a few years and a corporate pop punk thing would be totally like a real thing. And it's also interesting they kind of like were a little too early, to be honest. They knew that like how they looked at a band, they didn't look at it like we can't do boy band, we have to do something else. But that is actually in fact what the mega records did. They went into an opposite direction, kind of instead of like a boy band singing group, they went for an all-girl rock band, which is like a totally opposite thing, which is interesting. But I like their thing, and I also like the idea of pointing out that like we did have this whole, at the time 2001, we had this whole cycle of, you know, you're hot and big when you're young, then when you're older and there's like no career anymore, we'll exploit your story for behind the music, which was like showing the whole impetus of like the corporate culture at the time. Like they will find a different way to exploit everything forever and always, you know. And the whole idea of, you know, brands coming in and coming out, it felt like they'd go in and go out very deliberately, but it's almost that like people couldn't choose what they wanted, you know, as much. I think the idea of choice and a la carte kind of breaks down the whole idea of like these suddenly like fads coming up, because you'd see it brought up on radio or MTV and you almost like couldn't fight it in a way. Although I think people would. Like I remember not turning off MTV because like ska music was really big and stuff. Like you could reject it. You did kind of have that feeling in the air at the time, and I'm glad they kind of like found out like a really smart way to say it. And I think this movie ends up living on because of it, because this is like almost like more of what people feel about capitalism or late stage capitalism or consumerism than we did at the time. You know, I mean, it was like right after 9/11, George W. Bush was like, go out and buy things, and it's like that's what made America and made the society what it is like to consume, to buy things, to make, you know, NSYNC have the biggest sales week in the music industry's history. Like the whole idea of like, we're going to push these things so much you're going to fall in love with them. And as much as you want to call out like how it's silly that like these guys are like dancing around and posing and stuff, and that's like kind of very surface level, why are you not talking about these things? And I think what these writers, directors maybe like pushed this way too far, and they didn't get to direct again. Like Rachel Lee Cook majorly hurt her career after this. I think the only ones who really went forward post this was like Rosario Dawson and Alan Cummings, and that's about it. A few of the actors, like it didn't really dent them that much, but the few it did, it really majorly hurt their careers, which is unfortunate. You could maybe read into that, since they did point out the whole capitalist and consumerist culture and the subliminal messaging. You can't really do that well. Like people are really going to identify it right away. But I like the idea of kind of question this a little more, being like an ironic send-up of Josie and the Pussycats, and that's like what's made this film kind of live on. Like it's still a fun movie to watch. I don't like a lot of 90s teen movies, actually. Like I was really against them, and even I liked this at the time. I know people like completely overrated it then, but I still think it's like actually one of the shining examples of the period, really, because it's the only one who's like questioning a lot of what they're doing. And all those films had mega big soundtracks and star careers they were pushing and product placements and all those things. Like they were all like kind of evil movies, but this is, you know, being evil but doing it in kind of like a really interesting send-up way. It's probably, maybe other than Election, that like the only 90s kind of teen movies of my high school years that I really appreciate what it was doing, and I think it was actually doing something in a different way. I just always really like this movie. I think it is probably one of the more fascinating comic book or cartoon remakes, and also because when we think of capitalism, especially now, we think of IP. We think of how long you can stretch it, how much you can exploit that thing, and the fact that Josie and the Pussycats started as a comic book, went to a cartoon, has ridden the Generation X train, got even remade in the Saturday morning cartoons collection at the time, like kept bringing up in cool indie movies, and then became, you know, a big corporate remake thing with a soundtrack that sold really well with some of the best songwriters of their era, kind of shows you how much a company can exploit copyrighted material to the nth degree and keep making it matter to the masses and to the youth, whether they want it or not, but then they end up accepting it and just kind of continuing these kind of things forever and always, just because the company wants to keep making money and keep getting the kids into it. And maybe that's really the whole evil thing of the whole time, and they kind of knew that before anyone else was saying it, and we lived in the supreme IP era that we're currently in. I don't know. But either way, Josie and the Pussycats is one of the great, I think, comedies of the early 2000s, late 90s, which is almost sort of the same period. Pre 9/11, I always just think of the 90s. But it really is. It uses the kind of humor of Conan O'Brien and The Simpsons, and like that kind of humor I love, to really, criticize and point out what was going on at the time, and probably one of the great kind of capitalist satires we had in the 90s, and it has a pretty cool soundtrack to boot. So it's kind of one of the reasons I've always really liked Josie and the Pussycats. So if you have seen Josie and the Pussycats and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.